Hey everyone, welcome to Macstock's Community Chat, a limited run series that turns the tables, or maybe it turns the lectern, if you will, and gives us a chance to talk to the folks that make Macstock the awesome event that it is. And that's you, the very folks who attend and support Macstock each year. So it's something a little bit different. But I'm thinking of these talks as nothing more than a chance for members of the Macstock community to get to know each other a little bit better. Just something fun to do and something to do until we can all get together again next year and do this in person. And I think what we're going to discover is that everyone who attends Macstock has a pretty interesting story to tell, whether it's something new and cool that they're working on, their history with Apple's products, or even interesting past projects. It's all up for grabs, and we're going to talk about it right here. In this episode, we are speaking with Jim Rea of ProVUE Development. Jim, you are actually a relative newcomer to the Macstock community. I think you first attended in 2019?
Right, I've only been once.
Only been once. And then
Would have been
COVID.
twice, but
And then COVID.
I can see you now again, by the way.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I'm glad. It just makes this experience all the much better for you.
It does.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about your experiences at Macstock in just a bit. But first, I actually wanted to give folks a little introduction to you and your history with Apple in general, because we do have quite a few folks attending Macstock who go all the way back to the Apple II days, myself included. But you mentioned some particularly fascinating stories from the early days of the Macintosh that pretty much begin at the beginning, 1984. So why don't you tell us a little bit about when you got your first Mac and what got you started down this path of being a developer?
Well, actually, maybe go spend just a minute even further back, because I was a developer for like 8 or 9 years before the Mac came out.
Oh, wow. Okay. Cool.
I I got started. I built a computer from scratch, start from about 1975 to 1977. Not even a kit. Just bought integrated circuits, and part of it was wire wrapped, and part of it I designed my own
Really?
PC board. I still have that in the garage.
So we're not talking an Altair or anything like that. We're
Well,
we're talking
actually,
a custom Jim computer.
since you mentioned the Altair, there's actually a story involving that. So I was a subscriber to Popular Electronics. This was like I was probably a junior in high school, and
Me too.
so and I should have that Popular Electronics that had the Altair. I can't find it. I'm disappointed. I know I had it, and I wouldn't have thrown it away. But anyway, I got they had this article, build an Altair, and you could order a kit from MITS. But Popular Electronics back in those days, they had a deal that I guess it was some deal that they made with people because they were publicizing their stuff. Right, so you could send in a self-addressed stamp envelope, and they were supposed to send you the schematics and the thing to diagram for the PC board. And I'm like, yeah, I can't afford that kit, but yeah, I want that. So I sent them a self-addressed stamped envelope, and you know what they sent me back? They took the PC board for the Altair, which was I can't really fit it on my camera, but it was bigger than a sheet of paper. And they slapped it
Wow.
on a copier and pushed a button. And then, since it was bigger than a sheet of paper, they shifted it over and pushed the button again. And it's two-sided, so they flipped it over. So I got 4 sheets of paper that were Xerox of an unpopulated board. And
Oh
it's like,
man.
what the heck are you supposed to do with that? That's completely useless. You can't possibly, make a board off of Xeroxes, and the pieces didn't even line up, and it was just a scam. So I was like, nah, I don't need no Altair. So I wound up figuring out. I got the Intel spec book, read it like 11 times, which is also how I taught myself assembly language.
Wow.
And over a couple of years, I actually, built a computer that started out, basically had nothing, and it wound up having 56K of RAM and hooked to floppy, first cassettes and then a floppy drive, and it eventually ran CP/M. And I actually wrote
Nice.
a program on it, an editor, text editor program, a visual text editor program, which was, one of the very first to do that. And I actually sold that starting around 1978. I sold it through, I don't know
Really?
if you ever heard of Lifeboat Associates, but they were a company that sold CP/M software, probably the first seller of personal computer software in New York. And, I sold a few hundred copies of that editor, which was called PolyVUE,
Wow.
which I stole
Very
that
cool.
name from. I was going to Cal Poly Pomona for college by that point, and I started writing this program. It had no name, and I was walking around the campus, and I saw this sign that said, come to our open house, PolyVUE, and it was spelled VUE. And I'm like, I like that name. I'm stealing it. So that's how
And history was made.
the company got the name ProVUE, although it was originally called something else. Um, so yeah, so I did that, and then I went to work for this mini computer company called Alpha Micro that eventually made 68,000 base computers.
Okay.
Um, and so, that was actually a significant business. I had like a dozen employees and stuff like that. And so that's a whole other story. But so that's what I was doing in 1984. And the first I heard, so I never did the Apple II. I was aware of it, but I
Mm-hmm.
never had one. I kind of skipped that. I did CP/M, and then I did this Alpha Micro mini computer thing, but I never actually did Apple II, so I had nothing directly to do with Apple. But the Alpha Micro was sold through these dealers, and I remember in late '83, one of the dealers was, I guess, also an Apple dealer, and he says, "Hey, Apple's coming out with this computer called a Macintosh, and it's going to have a 68,000. And it sounds like it might be kind of cool." I'm like, "Oh, okay, I don't know, we'll see." So it did come out, obviously, in January, and I, saw the video, and I was like, "Yeah, that looks awesome." And hey, I know how to program the 68,000. And in fact, actually, I think it was just a week or two later, I went to a conference called SoftCon in New Orleans. They only had it once or twice, but it was supposed to be like Comdex, but for software. They were trying to do that, and Steve Jobs went to that, and I think it might have
Oh,
been the
cool.
keynote. He did the same talk that he did at the Flint Center at the stockholders meeting where he introduced the Mac, pulled it out of the bag.
Pulled it out of the bag and
He did, it was like a week or 2 weeks later, and he did the exact same. So I didn't see the original announcement, but I got to see it 2 weeks later, and I was
wow.
just like, I got to be involved with that. Um, so of course you couldn't get a Mac then, but 2 or 3 weeks after that, a friend of mine in Connecticut called me and he said, "Oh, the local dealership somehow got an extra." And like usually there was long waiting lists and whatnot, but somehow Apple accidentally shipped him one. And he's like, "They've got one. It's not spoken for. Do you want it?" Yes. So I actually wound up owning a Macintosh, which I think I still have that one. I know I do still have a 128K. I'm not sure if it's that one or not. And so he sent it to me, and I had it, and it was like, okay, but there's no way to program it because you couldn't program a Mac on a Mac back in those days. You had to have a Lisa, and then there was this special software that ran on the Lisa. So I found another dealership out here that would sell me a Lisa, and then somehow I had to bootleg the development software uh, because you're supposed to sign up for this developer program to get the development software, which I did. I immediately signed up, but it was, this is before the internet. It was like you wrote a letter and filled out a form, and 2 or 3 months later, maybe you'd get approved. And I'm like, I am not waiting. I need to be on the ground floor. So, like I say, I found a dealership that would sell me the Lisa, and then somebody, I think it was at Long Beach College. I don't know how I got a hold of the software. So, and I had one of the products I had written for this mini computer was a RAM-based database program that I called DataVUE. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make that for the Mac. So I started working on that, and nobody at Apple had any idea that I existed, other than I had sent this form in. So I started porting it and reading the documentation, poring over the documentation, and just teaching myself, in some cases wrongly, but in like 8 weeks, I had a very basic little program that you could demo. Like I don't think you could even save. It had one database built in, but I could show that you could search and you could sort and stuff like that. And then I had another friend in Chicago who had the rights to a C compiler. He didn't write it, but he licensed it, and he ported it to this Alpha Micro mini computer. So when the Mac came out, he was like, "Oh, I can port this to the Mac," and because the Mac didn't have a C, so Bob actually had the first C compiler for the Mac, and somehow he got in touch with the developer group up there, the evangelists, and had, I guess he must have been there, because he called me and he's like, "Jim, these people have to know about what you're doing." And so he put one of them on the phone. I think it was Alon Rossman, if you know that name. He was definitely the first person I met there. And Alon's like, "Okay, you've got this program, well, send it to us." And I'm like, no, I'm not sending you a program. But if you'll have me, I will get on a plane and I'll fly up there. So that's what I did. And I flew up to Apple. This was, I think, April or May of 1984. And I had my little bit of demo. And so I met with Alon Rossman. And if you Google him, he's a pretty well-known guy. And his boss was Guy Kawasaki. You probably remember Guy.
Of course. I've got his book right over there on the shelf.
Right, exactly. Well, so...
One of his books.
So, I put the disc in, and I wish I had a recording of this. It was, because he just got so excited. And it was almost like I lit his hair on fire. And he was like, "Where did you come from? How did you wrote this whole program and we've never, heard of you? That's impossible. You can't write a program without, we're begging people to write software, and here you've done it." And he thought it looked just like AppleWorks, which is interesting. He's like, "This looks exactly like AppleWorks." I'm like, "I don't know. I've never seen AppleWorks." So he started running up and down the halls there, and he's like, "Everybody, come look at this." And so his guy wound up taking over, and I got passed off to Guy, and so I was in with the developer program, and I have some Guy stories, but we'll save that for an in-person talk. And so I wound up, like maybe a month later or 6 weeks later, I was in Apple's booth at the National Computer Conference in Comdex demoing this thing. Mm-hmm. And then a couple months later, I got it finished and we started shipping it. And Apple brought me out to Hawaii. They had a sales conference. They used to have sales reps, and they
Yes, they did.
every year.
Yeah, they did. That's
every
right.
year they flew their sales reps to a meeting, and so they had like 6 software developers, because that's all the ones that were for the Mac. They flew us out there to Hawaii, and part of it was they had this little trade show, sort of a fake trade show that we demoed our software to the Apple sales reps. So, that was just like 6 hours. And then the rest of the time we were just in Hawaii for a week. And Apple at that time, boy, they knew how to run a party. They had caviar at every break. And they bussed us, everyone, a couple thousand people across the island at one point for a barbecue dinner. And then they had a band. And I was like, oh, I thought it was a cover band. And they were playing some, top 40 songs. And then listening to the banter, I realized, no, this is not the cover band. This is the band. They flew the top, 40 band to Hawaii to do a private show for Apple.
Wow.
I don't remember who it was now, but they were like, yeah, we were in Chicago yesterday, and now we're here in Hawaii. So
now this is 1984.
This was that was I think August of 1984.
So this is actually kind of the early genesis of Panorama.
Basically, yeah. In 19 that product was called Overview. And then starting in 1986, I rewrote the whole thing from scratch because, it was originally really a port from this mini computer. So it wasn't really designed like for the Macintosh. It didn't have really good graphics and some other stuff. So in 1986, I was like, okay, this is a real thing. I rewrote the whole thing from scratch. And it wasn't just me. There was a couple other people working for me, but mostly me. And so being a programmer and not really a marketing wizard, I thought, oh, it's a new program. I have to give it a new name. In retrospect, that was stupid. I should have, I had brand equity in the Overview name. And, for years, even now, sometimes people are like, oh, yeah, I used to use Overview. So it was, a very memorable name that had, and I threw it away. So, I should have called it a new version of Overview. But instead, I gave it the name Panorama, which is sort of like Overview, Panorama. They're similar, the concept's similar. Panorama, the all-new version came out in November of 88. So 4 years after Overview. So really, I should, if I'd kept the same name, I could say, yeah, I've been shipping continuously since August of 1984. And really, I have. But did change the name in 1988, and that's still a long time ago. That's more than 30 years. And people are like, yeah,
30,
BB Edit.
30, 33 years.
Yeah. So it's longer than BB Edit. It's longer than Photoshop. It's longer than Microsoft Word. I do like to, I like to say, well, ProVUE is the second oldest Mac software company. So then I like, yeah, exactly. You're searching your head. Who's the oldest?
Thinking Microsoft.
It's exactly Microsoft. That's right. But now here's the the double jeopardy question. What was Microsoft's program that was the first one shipped for the Mac in February '84?
It was Word, wasn't it?
No. Word was like 85 or 86.
I thought it was one of their Office apps. I thought it was Word, but you say no. What was it?
Multiplan.
Oh, Multiplan. Oh, gosh. Wow. Yeah, that's a throwback.
Right. That's every now and then somebody will get that. Most people don't, but every now and then somebody will come up with that. So Multiplan was the first, and then there was like PFS File and Habidex and Telos File Vision, and there was a Mac Kino, and then there was Overview. I think we were like the seventh one, and of course all those other ones, except for Microsoft, none of those other ones are around anymore. So
that's quite some history. Now, the history I knew of Panorama went back to 86, 88, But yeah, I wasn't aware of Overview and the history you had with its development before the Macintosh. So that's super interesting that you were able to take this product that you had in development all those years and migrate it. Well, I don't want to say so easily, but get it migrated over to the Mac so that you could continue its development and really just increase its popularity.
Well, actually, DataView was only about I think it was only about a year and a half old. That was not my, it wasn't my main product. The main product I had on the mini computer was a word processor that it was called SuperView. Um, but I didn't think that would be a good fit for the Macintosh because it really was not designed for, it was designed for 24 by 80, terminals. And, it
Right.
didn't know anything about fonts or, even bold or italic. It was, if you go back to this, it was based on like TROF and, text processing where you'd put a dot, you'd have dot commands
Yep.
embedded in the text to say,
Yeah.
dot margin, dot this, and that's how that worked. So it wasn't, it was sort of like slightly WYSIWYG for just the text, but it definitely wasn't at all WYSIWYG for fonts or styles or it could do that stuff and it could hook to a printer, but it was basically sort of like HTML where you have to, it's all in your head and then you render it.
Right.
So I didn't think, and it's funny because the world kind of came back around to that,
They
because that
have.
back in the 70s and early 80s, that's how all that, everything was just plain text and you'd embed commands in the text to tell it what to do. And then it went completely, that was like the old fashioned way and everything was completely WYSIWYG and the screen, whole idea was the screen is exactly, matches and there's no, and then we went back and then we've got HTML and we've got Markdown.
Markdown
Um,
is exactly what I was thinking of. I was waiting for you to say Markdown because that
yeah,
we should have Brett Terpstra on here, and you guys
we,
could just go back and forth comparing.
you should get John Gruber on here.
Get John Gruber on. Yeah.
Actually, the documentation for Panorama 10 is all completely written in Markdown. I suspect it might be the largest Markdown document in existence because it's like 6,000 pages.
One of the things you mentioned to me when you expressed an interest in coming on and being part of these community talks is that you have some pretty interesting stories from the early days of the Mac. Visiting Macworld, for example, or you already mentioned, I don't know, did you actually meet Steve Jobs during that talk or did you just hear him talk? But you actually have met Woz and
I didn't
Jobs.
meet him. I did not meet him at that New Orleans thing, although he was on the plane. We were on the same plane. Um, I live in Orange County in Southern California,
Hmm.
and the plane that I was on, I believe it went from San Jose to Orange County and then to New Orleans. So there was I recognized a bunch of people when I got on the plane, and walking down the aisle, and I'm like, oh, my God, that's Steve Jobs. Oh my God, that's, other, and of course these people weren't as famous as they were
Oh
now,
gosh, yeah.
but I knew who they were. And then the plane, came in for a landing, and there was a thunderstorm out just north of New Orleans, and the plane is like, and I was thinking, man, if this plane crashes, the headline's not going to be Jim Rea dies in plane crash, because
Well,
there was several famous people on the plane.
well, let's
Um,
let's let's think about that. You said you've been developing for 9 years at the time the Mac came out, and what Jobs and Woz go back with Apple to 75. So
right.
you've got a similar history
Well,
there.
yeah,
It
but
very well may have read Jim Rea. Thank goodness it didn't.
no, but I hadn't turned it into a Fortune 500 company by 1980. Um, so I did meet Steve a couple of times. I met Woz at that Hawaii thing, and he was very nice. That's the only time I ever met him, but he was he was a very nice person. And then he later was a customer. Um, he actually bought a bunch of panoramas. I think he used them. He was teaching high school for a while.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think he bought them and used them in the school because he bought like a bunch of them. And then the one funny part about that is one point, he had bought a bunch of them, and so at one point we had an update, and so we'd sent out a letter to everybody saying there's an update, right? And I got a letter back from some assistant or something of his saying, do not contact this Mr. Wozniak anymore. I was like, well, okay, but we just thought he might want to know there was an update. I'm sure he knew nothing about that. And like I said, when I met him, he was, I've met quite a few. I think I've met 4 billionaires, and he was very gracious in person, very very nice person. I met Bill
That's
Gates.
when you opted out of newsletters by having your assistant do it for you.
Well, I mean, it was the newsletter we sent out was it was a, it was just a form. Everybody got the same one. Yeah. It wasn't a personal letter to Woz.
Now, you with the development of Overview and later Panorama, you were one of the early exhibitors at Macworld, or right. Macworld Expo, I should say. Macworld Expo. You were one of the early exhibitors.
Yeah, we exhibited at all the early ones. We were there at the very first one, and one of the things that was, in retrospect, a bummer. At some point, they initiated a priority system where you got to pick in order of how long your seniority was as being an attendee. But so like the first 5 or 6 years, I was at every one. But then I think there was a year when I don't have an update. Let's skip a year. And then it turns out they implemented the seniority system. So had I realized, it was like, no, I should have gone every year. So then I was way back. So the first year we had a booth that was right at the door. We were the very first, you walked in and we had a 20 by 20 booth and it was right at the door. And that, by the way, was in Brooks Hall. It wasn't in Moscone. The first about 5 years were in a cellar. Underneath what was that, City Hall we were underneath? I'm not sure, but you went down this ramp and the whole thing was underground. It was pretty depressing. Except it was also really exciting because everybody was just so excited to both the vendors and all the customers were just so we really felt like we were changing the world. So
in many ways you were.
Yeah. It was very exciting, and I always liked we didn't have the internet then, and people called us on the phone, but that was our chance to meet people. So that was great. Although I also did a lot of user groups, so that was another a chance. I probably did over 100 presentations at user groups over 10 years, maybe 200. And you can still tell from our registration files that, obviously I did more of them in California than other places, and California is overrepresented in our user base. I think left over from that, but I got to Chicago. I think I did one in Milwaukee once, Dallas, Portland, Colorado. User groups were a lot of fun.
They're a lot of fun. They still are a lot of fun, and they still are. They're still an important part of the Apple community. Well, I think
there's not too many that are actually still exist as I guess Portland still has one, and Chicago apparently has one. But there was like LAMG. I remember one time I did a presentation there, and there were 400 people. And there used to be one called Mac Valley that would regularly get 300 people. And, that was really a kick to, theater performers talk about, the, what they get out of it. And I always thought that was crazy. Why would you want to do the same thing every day? And then when I did a presentation to a large group, I was like, oh, yeah, I'll do that again tomorrow. You just have to round up the 300 people somehow.
So
But the groups kept shrinking and shrinking, and then they also, it seemed like a lot of them had got like all the people, they turned into, sort of old folks' homes where all the people that were really doing stuff wandered, went off and did it and stopped hanging out at user group meetings. So that was kind of sad.
Yeah, I remember the user group meetings that I would go to in the mid 80s for the Sinclair line of computers were often older users. So it really hasn't changed that much from what I'm aware of being user group meetings, back in the day, because it was the older users who could afford the computers. It was the older users who had the time to
Well,
sit there and play with them and really fully understand how they worked. So it was interesting to go to one as an 18-year-old kid, and maybe my
so
perspective of what represented an older user was quite a bit
right,
different than it is now.
yeah, they were probably 30.
They were probably 30.
I have the same, I was always the youngest person, in most rooms I was in, and I still, it's like I'm 63 now, and I'm still like, what, what happened? I still, but I hesitated to use the word older because that's not really what I, quite, but it's more of a energy thing. It's like, some people are like, oh, I'm going to go out, figure things out, and it used to be those people were in user groups, so they would be like, oh, let me explain this new thing. And then those people got tired of explaining the new things to all the other people. It's like what you're talking about, printer, when my printer, they're like, oh, if I go to the user group, I'm just going to get waylaid by people that want to make, how to make my printer work. And so the people that really knew how to, that were the drivers of the excitement eventually, kind of, I don't want to do that anymore because all I'm doing is spending my time helping these people that don't want to help themselves.
Yeah.
But a lot of that action, has moved online. So there's online forums and things like that, and there's still, I mean, kind of segueing a little bit. I thought, for example, Macstock, that wasn't like that at all. And that the draw for something like that is the people there, and I think maybe part of it is that Macstock is like you should kind of have to get out of your way to get to it for most people. I probably would have gone a year or two later if it but it was like, well, what's this thing out in Woodstock? What?
Woodstock, Illinois.
You know?
Northern Illinois. Yep.
Yeah. So
Surrounded by cornfields.
You got to make an effort, and that the plus side of that is that winnows like the people that do make the effort. Oh yeah, those are the people I want to meet.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's a really fantastic group of folks who come out to Macstock, and it's a group that encompasses all ages, and that's what I love the most about it. And everyone there really wants to get the most out of the experience, whether it's meeting new people, learning what the presenters are offering on stage, or just learning from fellow attendees like we're doing here today. It's really an amazing group of people who come out to Macstock, and have been coming out to it for 5 years.
I had a great time. And I have to say I was really surprised because I went for the purpose of meeting people, and I wasn't really expecting to get much out of the classes, the lectures. I usually don't at things like that, and I was pleasantly surprised. I was actually like, oh wow, I actually learned a lot of stuff, which I wasn't. That was like a bonus for me. It wasn't why I went, and so. Cool.
That's actually super awesome to hear because, if I'm being honest, the educational aspect of Macstock is really always been at the core of it for me.
Right.
I want people to come and I want people to learn. I want people to grow and be able to go back home and try out some of these ideas and maybe learn something new. Maybe it'll set them down a path that they weren't on before, but because they learned this thing at Macstock, they're now down this other path of playing with shortcuts in iOS or what have you, and that's just really gratifying to hear that you had that kind of experience too.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't really expect that because a lot of times, especially stuff that's geared for users, it's like, well, I already know all that stuff. But there was bunch of stuff I didn't know. I was like, oh wow, I didn't know that. And for example, I had heard about Ulysses. I didn't really know about it, and now it's something that I worked into my workflow.
Mike Schmitz.
Because of a talk at Macstock.
Yeah.
So.
Now I do want to. You're right. We did kind of segue a little bit there. I do want to give you a chance to talk a bit about Panorama 10, which is where we're at now
Right.
with your app. 33 years. 33 years. It's still out there. It's still in
Yep.
active development. We talked a little bit about what led to its creation, but who should be using Panorama? Who is your target market?
Well, really anybody that needs to organize data. Um, so, and I would say especially there's a lot of people that are using spreadsheets to organize data. They're using Excel or numbers,
Yeah.
and those are not really designed for that. That's not what spreadsheets are for. So I built a tool that has a lot of the attributes of spreadsheets that people like, but it's designed to be a database. So, the big difference there is a database understands that the data has some structure. So, like if you have a mailing list, then you'll have columns for, name, address, city, state, zip. So you can enter your data into a spreadsheet that way, but the spreadsheet doesn't know, it's just A, B, C, D, E, F. So it can't leverage the fact that there is some structure. So, for example, know that, well, the state, should be capitalized automatically. And the city should, the first letter, and well, only numbers are allowed in a zip code, or maybe a pattern of 5 digits and a dash, and it can know that, okay, these are ways that this data can be analyzed and stuff like that. So basically, there's a lot of mental and cognitive load that if you're using a spreadsheet, you've got to take care of that manually, and the database, takes that off of you, and it's like, yeah, I know about structured data, and so I can go way further without you having to do that. So I think a big area I would look at is people that are using spreadsheets to do database work. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
And then the other thing is, about Panorama specifically compared to other databases, is that it's RAM based. So when you open a database,
you know what, Jim? I'm going to interrupt you right there, and I'm sorry for that. But one of the things that absolutely blows my mind about Panorama is that it's not surprising that it originated this way, that Overview was RAM based, or that the first editions of Panorama were RAM based, because that's what we did with our programs. We stuffed everything into the memory of the computer, and there was some very efficient coding back in the day. But with infinite resources, the fact that Panorama is all RAM based and it doesn't use indexes,
right?
So that even older Macs can store and manage and retrieve tens of thousands, heck, hundreds of thousands of records in just a few megabytes. It just blows my mind.
Well, it's funny because I think it's kind of backwards in a way. I think it was more surprising in the early days because RAM was much more constrained, limited than it is now. I mean, now you can get a computer with gigabytes of memory, and that used to be in the early days. The number one question was, "What's RAM based? Aren't I going to run out?
Hmm.
I'm not going to have enough room to hold my database," and nobody asks that anymore. Um,
Well, I guess I should qualify what I was saying and point out that my first computer, the first one that I owned, that I had my hands on, was actually a kit computer, and it had 1K of memory.
right.
And my second computer had 2K, which I upgraded to 16. And then my primary computer for many years after that had 48K. And all of these, my 48K computer, I did have some streaming storage and later 3 inch, not 3.5 inch, 3 inch floppies for it. But
Maybe
before that,
5 inch,
everything was,
5.25 inch,
no, 3 inch, three
three
inch,
inch. Never
three
heard of a
inch. It
3 inch.
was
There's three and a
Smith.
half, 5.25, and 8 inch.
Welcome to the world of Sinclair computers.
Oh my
So,
gosh! Did they
yeah,
make their own
Sinclair,
floppies?
they had, well, Smith Corona typewriters actually used these 3 inch floppies,
Huh.
and they were very difficult to come by here in the States. The dual drive, the dual 3 inch drive mechanism I got, now I'm completely derailing from conversation about you, but the dual 3 inch drive mechanism I had was about as wide as a 15-inch MacBook Pro, and maybe about, it was like a small VCR really,
Right.
and I imported that from Spain. So the Sinclair line of computers were from the UK, but this dual drive mechanism came from Timex Sinclair out of Spain,
Wow.
and I imported it through a third party retailer here in the States. But it was very difficult to get these discs until we realized, oh, Smith Corona uses these same discs.
Oh.
And we could, for a time, there was the smart typewriters back in 1983, 84, 85, would use these discs from Smith Corona. And so we could run into a Kmart or a Venture and get a two-pack of these 3 inch discs and reformat them and use them on the Sinclair computer. But before that, everything, because they were cassette based, when you wanted to do something, you had to load it up into that small amount of RAM that you have, whether it's 1K, 2K, 16K, or 48K in the Sinclair's case. And if you couldn't fit it in that memory, all bets were off. So I guess that's where my thinking was coming from, is that we often had some amazing programs that were developed for these platforms, and they made such amazingly efficient use of the processors, mostly through assembly language. In the Sinclair's case, it was Z80 assembly. But then, of course, in the Mac and Apple IIs and all that, they had the floppies, but when you had to load everything that you wanted to run in memory, that was all you had. So that's where I was
Right.
coming from
But
with that. Yeah.
um, and just a quick aside, I met the guy that designed the Z80.
Did
Um,
you?
but we can talk about that offline at some point. But and the 8080 too, actually. But so the thing was, and actually, I did a talk at Mac Talk, not Mac Talk, Mac Tech conference a couple of years ago about this. It's on my website. I think you might actually be interested in it, and talked about RAM versus disk based, and what that is about. So it started that basically the early computers were all tiny like that. Even big, commercial computers only had maybe 8K of memory or something like that, right? Tiny bits of
Yeah.
memory. And the disks weren't that huge either, but more than that. So, but these companies wanted to automate things and have databases of things, and obviously wasn't going to fit in memory, but they still wanted to do it, right? So they came up with these disk-based schemes for database programs to allow them to work with data sets that were much larger than memory. Of course, they to do that was really difficult and complicated and involved a lot of compromises. So that's why indexes were invented, so that you could because if you had to search the disk, and go through and access every record on disk, it would take maybe hours. So
You had to know where the data was.
You didn't know where the data was. So they invented all these systems that would enable them to break out of the memory and have a data set that's bigger than what would fit. And and basically every database person that team that wrote a database was like, okay, yeah, we've got to do this because every product has compromises, right? There's always some compromise. But for a database, everybody said, we're not going to compromise on the absolute size of the database. It has to be able to, automate GM's payroll or whatever, right? And so then meanwhile, computers were changing, and even in the 80s, the RAM size, it wasn't 1K, it still wasn't that big. The original Mac was 128K.
128.
Pretty quickly they got to 512. So, it was getting bigger. It was still, you're not going to fit GM's payroll in a 512K computer. But, the trend was there. RAM is eventually going to get bigger. But the database, programmers are all ignoring that and just assuming, well, we have to put it on disk because that's the only way the data can fit. So around 1983, I think I was in the shower actually, and I just had this idea. Wait a minute, what if I said I'm willing to compromise on the absolute size, and say I'm willing to say it has to fit in memory. What does that buy me? What do I get for doing that? Well, gosh, there's an awful lot. I don't need the indexes. I can do the searches, rapidly, just right in memory. And that means that it's so much more flexible. So, the thing about an index is you have to plan it in advance. You can only do that fast search on something that you've actually so you have to carefully, every database and people spend, they huge amounts of money to research exactly how should we set up the database and plan it so that we know what's going to do. Well, Panorama is like, no, screw that, just play with it. If that search doesn't work, try this other search. It doesn't matter. They're all happen like this. One of my favorite examples is another thing that you do in a disk-based database is you very carefully plan what are the fields. How am I going to structure the data and split it up? Like, are first and last name going to be separate fields, or is it going to be one field? Like last comma first. Those are decisions, and you have to make. And if you make the wrong one, it's really hard to change it later. Right? If you make it one field and then later, after you've entered 50,000 records, you're like, I really wish I'd made that two fields. Well, probably you're not going to change it because that's just too hard, right? In Panorama, you can just go in, say split fields, split it at the comma, boom, a quarter of a second, it's split. And then you could be like, oh, well, wait, I didn't want to, it turns out I don't like that. Okay, undo. Boom. In fact, Panorama 10 has a multi-level undo, which is unheard of for a database. I mean,
Oh yeah.
most programs most programs
You're
have
stuck.
it, but Panorama doesn't. So, I mean, but databases do not have, because on the disk there's no way you could do that. So, like in Panorama, you could go in and say, all right, let's delete all the records from Arizona. Oh, wait a minute, I want those records back. Well, I just say undo, and so Panorama really encourages you to play and experiment, and you don't have to plan everything in advance. You can just work with it, almost like, Play-Doh or something, where a traditional disk-based database, it's very rigid. It's very, you have to plan everything. And if your requirements change, boy, you better, make a requisition and, start a committee or,
Well, I was just thinking, having experience with MS Access, SQL Server, MySQL, FileMaker, all these different databases, it really sounds like Panorama is kind of the database for the every person. Anyone who needs to somehow view, manipulate, search through data, this is seemingly, from how you're describing it, a nice, easy, kind of more creative way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's really for anybody as long as your data will fit in RAM. And, I guess one of the disappointments is, I haven't, it seems to me like it should have taken over a big segment of the market, and I didn't manage to do that with my marketing. But there's a lot of people out there that I think are, wasting a lot of their time because they're not using Panorama. If they were using Panorama, they, they would, it would be saving them a lot of time and frustration. And, the flip side is I do have a really loyal customer base, and people that do use it are like, they feel like, wow, I've got a secret weapon that, is my advantage over, whoever my competitors in, whatever business I'm doing, because I've got this tool and they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Absolutely.
I can run circles around them in terms of, organizing and also analyzing and, um, getting value out of my data. It's also really, because you can manipulate it this way, and it's got analysis tools that, again, because it's in RAM, it can work with really quickly. You can, in fact, really the shower genesis that I had like in 1982 was I read an article that said that, for most businesses, like, 80% of your business is 20% of your customers. And there's a lot of, things in the world where, you've got that 80-20 rule. And the trick was, well, who are the 20% of my customers that do the 80% of the business? And I couldn't find a tool that would tell me that. And I actually, went and took the database that I had then of my customers at the time and by hand went through, and I was like, well, there's got to be a better way to do that. So that's sort of what the genesis of where I started, the idea for overview in the first place was, how can I find out who the 20% are?
Wow.
But if you go onto ProVUE.com, there's about a 20-minute video that shows, really, like, it shows stuff like splitting a field. And another example is like if you import data, you've probably I'll bet you've imported data into a database once or twice.
Just 2 days ago.
And I bet you've had situations where that import had junk in the import that you had to clean up.
It did, and I left it alone. I said, I'm not going to
Well, there's that too. But, and like, for example, a particularly bad one was, say you had where some of the, maybe had, comma delimited data, but some of the rows had commas missing. So then the rows are out of alignment. Yeah. How hard is that to fix? Go watch the video. That's about halfway through the Panorama video, and I've got a data set, a CSV file that has missing commas on about a third of the field, and I show how in Panorama, in 3 clicks, in about 15 seconds, you can fix that.
Oh man, I have one client who every month sends me data from their program, their business, It's a custom app that was written for them. I shouldn't say custom app. It was a custom program that was written for them many, many years ago. And they're in the process of shutting down the business. It's taking them 2, 3, 4 years to do this, but the staff has wound down, and so she sends me the data each month to kind of manipulate and get back to her in an Excel spreadsheet format that she can work with. And for that one client, I wrote a little script in VB Edit to do exactly what you're talking about, because I know where the problem is in her data file. So it was easy to write a script to kind of clean that up and get it back to her. But to be able to do that on a random data file, and to be
Right.
able to get this data back into format where commas are missing in that CSV file is huge, huge.
We have some customers that's all they do with it. They don't actually use the database part, but they'll, like use it to clean up data. So they'll import something, clean it up, and then export it back out as a text file, and then give that to whatever they're actually going to use it.
Now, for a product that's been around 33 years, it's been around a nice long time, not including overview. We understand
Right.
there's the history before, but for Panorama to have been around for 33 years, and this loyal customer base that you mentioned, there have been some real benefits to them for staying loyal to you. I mean, it's impressive that you've been able to take Panorama and stay in step with every major shift that the
Well,
Mac has taken. I mean, look, you've introduced PowerPC support. You've jumped to OS 10. You shifted to Intel. I imagine Apple Silicon support is coming too. I couldn't
yeah,
tell on
it's
your
not there
site
yet, but
if it's there yet.
it's
But
not there yet.
you've been kind of there in step along with Apple
Well,
the whole way, and that's great for your customers.
not they would tell you not in step. So, um, Panorama 10 came out in 2017,
Yeah.
and so 3.5 years ago, basically, and that's really when native OS 10 got supported. Um, Up through Panorama 6, it was still a Carbon app, a 32-bit Carbon app, and Panorama 10 is almost like a relaunch of the product because it took a long time. It basically took another complete rewrite. I rewrote it all in Objective C, and of course, uh, you know, 3 years into that, Apple introduced Swift.
Of
So
course.
it's like, oh, I'm rewriting it in the latest modern language. No, I guess I'm not. But it is still using the latest frameworks. It's written, using AppKit, which, of course, now they've got Swift UI. So maybe, it does feel like you're chasing this ball down the road. But Swift UI still has AppKit underneath. But we and that's part of the problem was that we got stuck on this. In fact, I mentioned this Windows Mac, that I had the dual version, but it was
Hmm.
using System 7 APIs, which then later, was able to make into Carbon APIs. But so, everything was locked to this. I couldn't do anything that wasn't in this Mac to Win program. So I had cross-platform, but it kind of got me stuck where I couldn't really fully move into OS 10. It did work, but people would. It didn't look like a modern app. People would. We stopped picking up new customers for a long time because people would download it and look at it and go, "This looks like it's from the early '90s," and it did.
Hmm.
And it wasn't 64-bit, and it didn't have multi-level undo. Um, so took a pause, stopped marketing it too, really. I mean, it never went off the market. There's customers that have been using it all along.
Hmm.
Um, and we've been in business all along, but there was a long pause from basically 2010 to 2017. So Panorama 6 came out in 2010. Panorama 10 came out in 2017. So that's a long gap. And I guess it's sort of a testament that we were able to not go out of business even with a 7-year gap, and it took that long. That was constant. It was working, 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 and working and working.
What was a massive overhaul you undertook?
Massive overhaul.
I mean,
Yeah.
there was an interesting nugget on your site that mentioned that up through Panorama 6, which was the version just prior to Panorama
Right.
10, there was an interesting nugget that there was still code in Panorama 6 running in 2018 that was in the original product
Right.
in 88.
A lot of it. A lot of code.
And that, well, I mean, one, that's a testament to how well that code was written, that it was still, you were still able to use it,
Yeah.
that far into the future of the product. But with that kind of history, it's not surprising that in order to think about the future for your customers and for new customers, that you had to kind of, tear it down and build it back up again. And that's what you did with Panorama 10. From everything I can tell and from what you've been describing, it's been well worth the effort.
I think so. And I should specify that since Panorama 10 came out, we are getting new customers. And so, my plan seems to have worked. People, are getting it and looking at it and going, "Oh, this is awesome." So, we need to get more people looking at it, but whenever, I haven't done too many promotions, but I've done like the Winterfest promotion a number of times. And whenever we do that, we get a big rush of people to the website, and then a bunch of people doing the trial, and then a bunch of people buying it. So, I'm working on a major release right now, which is going to wind up, part of that will be the M1 thing. So once I'm kind of holding off on promotions, but I think once I get that out and have, the M1 part out, then I think I'm gonna do some more promoting, because I think the product's worth it. It's a great product. So
Well, I have one last question on Panorama. So I mentioned the 33 years. With all those years under your belt, countless users, what is the coolest use case scenario you've come across in all that time? It's a very flexible product. So I imagine you've seen some pretty interesting things.
there's all kinds of interesting things. There's one that comes to mind that I don't know a whole lot about, but I got an email from a guy about almost a year ago, and he was apparently using it for some kind of COVID-19 research.
Really?
And I'm not sure. Well, yeah, there's quite a few researchers that use Panorama, because again, that's the sort of thing where the fact that you don't have to plan in advance is great. You don't know where the research data is going to take you, and you might be looking at this data, and then you're like, oh, okay, I want to dive into this more, and you can reorganize things. So I think it's perfect for that kind of application. There was somebody that was actually selling. There are some people that take Panorama and build applications and resell them.
Really?
So there was a guy he's not doing it anymore, but he was doing that. He had some sort of a mouse genetics database that he sold into that market. There was a guy. He's unfortunately passed away now, but he did a program for organizing track meets, like college track meets, with Panorama, and he did really well with that for quite a while. And it kind of sold itself, because they would use it and they would get the results in 15 seconds, and people are like, how did you get those results? Oh, well, I used this program. Well, where do I get that program? But that would, in addition to just doing the results, it would do things like all the lane assignments, and there was one meet that he was involved with that had 30,000 people.
Wow.
And he never did the Olympics, but he always told me, well, the Olympics would be so easy. It would be trivial to do the Olympics because, first of all, there's only a few hundred people, and if you're an Olympic event, you're going to show up. So I guess these, some of these big college events, people decide at the last minute whether they're going to go or not. Like I'm tired. I'm not gonna bother with that race. So they couldn't do they had to come up with the lane assignments, in the last 2 minutes before the thing started. Whereas the Olympics, they know who's going to be doing everything a week ahead of time. Anyway, this guy was doing COVID research, so talking about database size, he the reason why he was contacting me was because he was importing this data into Panorama, and it was taking a while. It was taking 14 hours to import the data, but it was 62 gigabytes of data.
Holy cow!
Yeah, and
Now this was memory based.
yeah, this is memory based. He's importing 62 gigabytes, and and I don't remember if he told me this. I know other people have tried. I know somebody that imported a database of every single cell phone transmitter in the world, and that was 32 gigabytes, I think. And they tried to import it into Excel, and Excel just crashed.
Oh yeah.
So this guy was, he was like, we need to do this. We're doing this a few times a week. Is there any way we can make it go faster than 14 hours? And I actually did have an idea, which I think might have worked because he didn't get back to me. But of course, your first thought is, I wonder if you can get a faster computer, right? But he did include in his email that he had a Mac Pro, one of the new ones, with 28 cores and 1.5 terabytes of RAM.
Holy cow!
So I figure that's a $60,000 computer, which tells me that somebody really was interested, valued the research he was doing.
Oh, absolutely! Wow. Okay, one more question then. How many years did it take before you earned your Master of Wizardry? That's my last question.
I'll let you know if it I've got the beard for it now.
By the
I
way,
still have hair.
I should probably comment. It's nice to see you appropriately adorned with your
Right?
Macstock hat, and I think you have a virtual Macstock shirt on there.
I do.
So 2019 was your first year at Macstock.
Right.
What you kind of hinted at this, maybe, well, I guess you maybe even overtly said, but what made you decide to attend Macstock in 2019? What was it that kind of said, all right, I'm gonna go?
Well, for one thing, I am kind of a community person, which is interesting. When I was 20, I don't think I would have said that. I was shy, but over the years, I've learned I like hanging out with people. I loved going to Macworld and seeing, like being able to just walk down the aisle and every 15 feet, oh, hey, Tom, hey, that was just great. And actually, even back in the Alpha Micro days, when that was the mini computer, that there was a whole community around that, which was neat. It was a small community, but everybody knew each other. So and I had seen some things that you were trying to recreate that aspect of Macworld. So that immediately, spoke to me. I think I can't remember when I first heard about it. It might have been 2017 or 2018. So, and I heard, sometimes I listen to, not all the time, but sometimes I listen to David Sparks' Mac Power Users. So I think he mentioned, after going to it, and did Adam Engst, has he been to Macstock?
No, I don't
think
believe he has.
Maybe he hasn't. He's a friend of mine. So, but there was, I don't know. There was people that I listened to, or in some cases even know, that came back from 2017 and 2018 and wrote about it, and I'm like, that sounds really cool. In fact, I think at least in 2018, I looked like where's this Woodstock place, and oh gee, it's kind of hard to get to. um, so in 2019, I was like, I really want to go, but I knew my wife probably would not want to go to some Mac thing.
But she did.
She did go. So what happened was she had been pushing that she wanted to go to Niagara Falls. She's like, I want to go to Niagara Falls. I want to go to Niagara Falls. And I actually wasn't that excited about it, which is funny because we did go and I just loved it and I want to go back more than she does, actually. But anyway, so she kept going on and on about this. And actually, she really has good ideas. A few years ago, she really wanted to go to Monticello, Jefferson's home.
Yeah.
And I was like, really? You want to fly across the country to go see some guy's house? Well, anybody watching, do it. It is so awesome. Monticello. Have you ever been?
I have not been. No.
It is really interesting, and the location of it is really interesting, and the architecture. Apparently, Jefferson said it had everything except everything you could want except a view of a live volcano. Yeah. But anyway, so she wanted to go to Niagara Falls, so I thought Niagara Falls, it's not that far from Illinois. Maybe we can combine that, and I can sell it like, here, I'll go to Niagara Falls, and you come to Macstock.
Yep.
And she was like, okay. So I was like, really? So that's what we did. And the interesting part is she had a great time at Macstock, and we both loved the area. It's such a beautiful area, at least that time of year. In fact, she was like, man, this is so beautiful. And I had to keep telling her, like, remember, this is not what it looks like in February. We don't want to move here.
It has its own beauty. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, but it's also, we are both Californians. So I don't, but we just driving around, it was like, it's a beautiful area, and we came a day early, and I like trains, so we went in Union to the
Oh, you did? Oh, good.
Illinois Railroad Museum.
Yeah.
And
That's the next town over.
We actually didn't get to Woodstock, which now in retrospect I'm sorry, but I guess we'll do it next time. And yeah, so just the whole area that was really fun, and then Macstock itself was fun. Met lots of great people. Some people that I knew, caught up with some people that I hadn't seen since Macworld. For 10 years. Met some new people. And then the sessions turned out, were awesome. So that was great memories. So it was a great trip. And I'm really looking forward to 2022.
Me too.
Yeah.
When I came up with the idea for these talks, one of the things that came to mind was the conversations we have around the lunchroom table at Macstock.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look at the time now, we're about 20 minutes into the next session. We've had our lunchtime conversation,
Right.
and we're now with 20-minute sessions, we probably even missed the post-lunch session here. So I'm thinking we should probably go ahead and wrap things up on this conversation. What do you think?
Okay. We can do that. But,
All
that's
right.
what I would do there. I would prioritize the conversation over the session. I do that at WWDC too.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of folks.
Especially since they're videoed.
Yeah, that's one of the things that people like the most. I've heard this from several folks, is the hallway track.
Exactly.
The conversations that you have in the hallway. You mentioned David Sparks. I know he had a lot of fantastic hallway conversations in 2018, and then, of course, came back to present later. But yeah, that's one of the things that people enjoy the most. And there's plenty of room there at the college to spread out and have those conversations and not be overlapping others. But if you decide that you want to go join another one, you just kind of walk up and people welcome you into it. It's really amazing.
And then there was more at the hotel too.
Oh gosh, until 2 in the morning.
Right.
Until two
Yeah,
in the
that was
morning.
one thing
Yeah.
my wife's like, "Are you tired of this?" She does that at every event. I'm always like, I want to keep talking. She's like, it's time to go to bed.
Always, always do. There's always more talking to do. But with that said, I think that's going to do it for this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you have any comments or feedback on the show, or you have an interesting project that you'd like to share with the community, just drop me a line, mike@macstockconference.com, or you can send me a note on Twitter @MacstockExpo. I would like to thank my special guest, Jim Rea of ProVUE Development, for joining me today. Thank you, Jim. What's the best
Thank
way
you.
for folks to get a hold of you or to learn more about Panorama 10?
Well, the best way to learn about Panorama 10 is to go to provue.com, PROVUE.com, weird spelling. And as I mentioned, there's a video, which I think is the best way to start. And there's also a free trial you can download and check it out. And in fact, in addition to that one video, there's also there's actually about 40 videos that if you want to get more into it. And all the documentation is online also, so you can really investigate it. And there's also, we have a very active online community at forum.provue.com. And I'm also personally, I have a Twitter account, ProVueJim, same spelling. That's less company and it's more my personal thing, but so, I have fun there. And you can always reach me there. You can also reach me on the forum, and if you send email to ProVUE, that'll get to me too.
That's awesome. And if people have been paying attention, you said it was a strange spelling, but they know the derivation, the history of that
Right.
spelling now, and they know where you stole it from. But we
Yeah.
won't tell anyone. We won't tell anyone.
I think we just did.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.